You flip a switch tonight. The room fills with light. You don't think about it. You never do. But for over 99% of human history, that switch didn't exist. There was no light on demand. There was only the sun, and then there wasn't. And when the sun went down, your ancestors didn't just sit in the dark and wait for morning. What they actually did is far stranger and far more sophisticated than they went to sleep. Here's the real story. Picture a small settlement, maybe 10,000 years ago. The sun drops below the horizon, the temperature falls with it, and the entire rhythm of human behavior shifts all at once, without a single word spoken. This wasn't a random shutdown. It was a switch between two completely different modes of being human. Daylight mode was about output, food, tools, travel, defense, the business of staying alive. Darkness mode was about something else entirely, something we've almost completely lost. So what filled those hours? Fire mostly, but not fire the way you picture it. Fire wasn't just heat and light. It was the center of the entire social world, every single night, for hundreds of thousands of years. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that the control of fire may be one of the true foundations of human evolution itself. Not just for warmth, and not just for keeping predators at bay. For cooking. Cooked food unlocks far more calories than raw food, and it takes far less time and energy to chew and digest. That single shift, Wrangham suggests, may have freed up the biological resources that allowed the human brain to grow as large as it did. It also freed up something else. Time. Hours that used to disappear into chewing raw roots and tough meat were suddenly available. And where did that free time go? Straight into the firelight, after dark, doing something humans still crave and rarely get enough of. Talking. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years recording nighttime and daytime conversations among the Jew/Hwansi, a hunter-gatherer people of the Kalahari, and found something surprising in the pattern. Daytime talk was practical. Complaints, coordination, gossip about who has resources and who doesn't. But nighttime talk around the fire shifted almost entirely into a different register. Storytelling, myths, ancestors, explanations for why the world is the way it is. This wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't just entertainment to pass the time. Darkness stripped away the tasks of the day. What was left once the chores were gone was identity itself. Culture, passed mouth to mouth, generation to generation, with no other way to store it. No books, no recordings, just firelight and voice. Ask yourself something. When was the last time you sat in near darkness with other people and simply talked, with no screen glowing between you? But darkness wasn't only for stories. It was also dangerous. And ancient people built entire systems around managing that danger without a single light bulb to help them. Someone had to keep the fire alive. All night, every night. Let it die, and you lose warmth, protection from predators, and the only light for miles. So groups rotated watch, a job passed quietly from person to person as the night wore on. Feed the flames. Listen, watch the tree line. Wake the next person when your eyes start to fail. This wasn't a chore invented for survival manuals. It was one of the earliest forms of shared responsibility humans ever practiced, a nightly trust exercise repeated for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone wrote the word trust down. And when the fire wasn't enough, the moon was. Ancient calendars weren't built around convenience, they were built around light. Hunts, travel, and gatherings were timed to fall near the full moon, when the night briefly turned bright enough to move safely across open ground. A dark moon meant staying close to camp. A full moon meant the world opened back up for a few nights, and then closed again. Your ancestors didn't check a weather app before making plans. They checked the sky, because the sky was the only forecast that mattered. Fear had a job to do here too. Nearly every culture on Earth independently developed the same idea, in different words. Something dangerous lives in the dark. Spirits, monsters, ghosts. It's tempting to dismiss this as simple superstition, a failure to understand the world. But look at what the fear actually did. It kept children near the fire. It kept the curious from wandering into terrain they couldn't see, terrain that really did hide real predators. The stories weren't a bug in ancient thinking. They were a low-cost, high-compliance safety system running on imagination instead of infrastructure. And it worked well enough to keep passing down for tens of thousands of years. Because here's where the story gets even stranger. Ancient humans didn't just sit around a fire and then collapse for 8 straight, unbroken hours. For most of history, night wasn't one long block of unconsciousness. It was 2. Historian A. Roger Kirch spent years combing through diaries, court depositions, medical texts, and literature from before the era of industrial lighting, and found hundreds of casual references to something almost nobody talks about today. A first sleep and a second sleep. People would go to bed shortly after dark, sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake. Not in a panic, not from insomnia. This waking period was expected, normal, unremarkable enough that it barely needed explaining in the historical record. People used the time to pray, to reflect, to talk quietly with a partner in bed, sometimes even to visit neighbors who were also awake in their own version of the same in-between hour. Then, after an hour or so, they would drift back down into a second sleep, carrying them through to dawn. Think about that. An entire calm, unremarkable hour of wakefulness built into the middle of every single night, for thousands of years, across entire continents. And it simply vanished within a few generations. Why? Because artificial light didn't just push back the boundary of the day, it erased the shape of the night itself. This is where the science gets genuinely strange. Sleep researcher Thomas Vare ran a study putting modern volunteers into extended periods of near total darkness, roughly 14 hours a night, mimicking pre-industrial winter conditions with no artificial light source at all. Within a few weeks, the exact segmented sleep pattern that Ekirch had found buried in old court records reappeared on its own. Not because anyone taught the participants to do it, their bodies simply remembered a pattern that the modern world had trained out of them in barely a century. Segmented sleep wasn't some primitive quirk your ancestors were stuck with before they figured out proper sleep. It may be the actual default setting of the human body, quietly waiting underneath 100 years of electric light. So if the body already knows this rhythm, why did it disappear so completely, so fast? Because artificial light didn't just add hours onto the day, it rewired the signal your brain uses to know what time it even is. Your eyes contain specialized cells that do almost nothing except measure how bright the world is, feeding that information to a small structure deep in your brain that runs your internal clock. For nearly all of human history, that clock had one dominant input and one input only. The sun, dim orange firelight at night, barely registered against it. Your ancestors' brains received an honest signal every day of their lives. Bright means day, dark means night. Full stop, no exceptions, no ambiguity. Then came the electric bulb, and with it, an artificial daytime that could run at any hour you wanted it to. Your brain, still running that same ancient software, treats a bright room at 11 at night almost the same as it treats noon. It suppresses the hormone that would otherwise tell your body to wind down. It keeps you alert long past the point where your ancestors would have been drifting toward the fire, telling stories, or easing into that gentle first sleep, or letting their minds wander during exactly the kind of undirected, half-awake thought that modern psychology now links to memory consolidation and creative insight. There's a bitter irony buried in all of this. You have more control over light than any human who has ever lived. You can banish darkness entirely at the flick of a finger in every room of your home. And somehow, by nearly every measure researchers can find, you sleep worse than almost all of them. Because darkness, it turns out, was never dead time. It was scheduled time. Time for language, for myth, for identity, for rest that arrived in two honest waves instead of one exhausted crash at the end of an overstimulated day. Ancient people didn't merely survive the dark despite lacking electricity. In a strange way, the dark helped build them. The fire pulled people in close, night after night, for tens of thousands of years. The long night gave their minds room to wander, twice, with a quiet, unhurried hour in between that modern life doesn't even have a name for anymore. Now think about your own night. The blue glow at midnight. The scroll that never quite ends. The tired mind that can't tell if it's overstimulated or simply exhausted, because somehow it's both at once. You don't keep a fire watch anymore. Nothing is going to wander out of the tree line into your bedroom, but your body doesn't fully know that. It still runs the same ancient alertness software, the same instinct to stay a little on guard once the light goes down, except now there's no fire to watch and no story to tell while you do it. So the alertness has nowhere to go. It just sits there, low and restless, at exactly the hour your ancestors would have been settling into their first sleep. Consider, too, what you traded away without ever agreeing to the trade. Every one of your ancestors for hundreds of generations in a row had a guaranteed hour of quiet, waking stillness in the middle of the night. A small pocket of time that belonged to nothing except their own thoughts. You have almost unlimited hours of light instead, and somehow far less time that feels like it belongs to you. You didn't lose the human need for that fire, that story, that midnight stillness. You just traded it for a switch on the wall, and you were never given the chance to notice the trade was happening. And tonight, when you flip that switch and the room floods with light, maybe don't think twice about it, the way you never do. But maybe, just for a moment, wonder what your ancestors would have been doing right now, in the dark, wide awake in the middle of the night, and completely at peace with it.